Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another session of the Doctor's Lab with Dr. Khalid Green and myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker. And first, I want to get into this by welcoming brother Khalid. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. How are you, my brother?
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. Alhamdulillah.
I see that you've got your coffee with you, and we've both got our hoodies on. Usually, some might be thinking, how come Abdul Haqq in a hoodie in UAE, in Dubai, because it's hot and everything.
Right.
And it's been cold here by Dubai's, by UAE standards, mashallah.
Right.
It's been cold, so the hoodie is necessary today. Alhamdulillah.
Subhanallah. Yeah. I noticed that myself. Subhanallah.
MashaAllah. Now I was just watching the news before we came on, and the cold snaps in the East Coast are quite heavy. And how's it affecting you there in New Mexico?
New Mexico it's cold, but it's typical cold. Like yesterday, during the day, it was, of course, I'm Fahrenheit. It was like 60 in the 60s. It was warm. You could almost wear shorts.
MashaAllah.
And then at night, I mean, it just drops like after, like right around Maghrib, it drops and it's in the teens. It's like below freezing,
Yeah. Now you can imagine. Yeah. Same.
That's kind of typical for this time, this place. Yeah.
You can imagine it's hot in the day, and then it drops in the morning to about 14, 15. And if you're at 30, 35 or late upper 20s, then that's a problem. But alhamdulillah, I want to say wa alaikum salam to Kira, Zikra, Abdul Majid, Nama, who I've just seen here. Yes, MTB, Dubai gets really chilly in the night during February. You're absolutely right, mashallah. We're just about to move into February. And today, Khalid, the subject we're looking at today, navigating Muslim identity in the West. And while we've touched on aspects of this in previous sessions, we haven't focused on it per se, and I think it's necessary to look at that today. Now, I dedicated a whole chapter in my PhD and subsequent book to Muslim identity, because there are various considerations that need to be made, considering, as we've mentioned previously, that we are living in unique times with the number of Muslims living in the West. This is something unprecedented as far as numbers are concerned, as far as populations are concerned. As I've mentioned previously as well, that the Muslim population in Europe could take over one or two Scandinavian countries if you were to transfer all of the Muslim populace into those countries. Wa alaikum salam, the red tiger. So I feel we should look at that, because we are not a single group. We're not homogenous in the sense that we have a single identity. And also, when looking at our identities, we have to consider them within the context of the environments that we're actually living in. Okay. The American context and environment is different to the UK context, the mainland European context, France, particularly if we look at what's happening there, and other mainland European countries have different environmental context, which we have to navigate our identities within. So let me ask you, America as well, it's not the same in particular parts of America, let alone as a whole group, as a Muslim populace.
Right. We're definitely different, dealing with many different realities between countries, between regions, between states. Where I'm at, as you mentioned, New Mexico is so different. The Muslim population, it's one of the least populated states anyway. And then so the Muslim population is very low. Where I'm living, very few. I've actually never stepped inside the masjid. There is a masjid. It's only open for Jumu'ah. So I only happen to run into some of the Muslims there. It's literally a handful. They're all migrants who come as doctors. So the reality there is quite different than where I'm from in Seattle, which, we have a pretty big, and I would say a thriving Muslim community there. So the reality, the issues, that we deal with, it's just quite a difference. And then, as you mentioned, between countries, France, they're with the politics and the policies towards Muslims.
I have a quick question on what you just mentioned there.
Yeah.
Can that place be considered a masjid if it's only open for Jummah?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, so it's definitely a musalla. We know that it's a musalla. It is a place where the people gather and pray. So, those are fiqh issues that require kind of look into, but in general, it's, would probably be considered technically as a musalla, but the people, no one, I don't think anybody prays at all except really that Jumu'ah, and maybe they get together on a Sunday or something. I don't know. I've never been inside the masjid. Never.
Yes.
I had to pray in the parking lot because when I first came here, I didn't know that it really wasn't occupied. Yeah.
And this is interesting. This dovetails nicely into what we're going to be discussing, because that's a environmental or socio need or requirement of that community there, that you have only gone to the masjid on Jummah. You're unaware of any other time, but the 5 congregational prayers are not being held as such.
Yeah.
And we know that the masajid, the mosques, are central places around which communities grow. The mosques are that identity marker for Muslims. Right, especially in the West, because we have different denominations, delineations, and so the mosque in itself, whether it's opened or not, where it's located, the ethnicities that attend there, the madhahib or the delineations that they subscribe to, all gravitate around the mosque. So that's very interesting. Looking at the dynamics that you've mentioned, or lack of therein, what you've mentioned. So for me, look, one of the things I want to do is go into an element to really lay the ground, and we are going, as we do, we get into the academics of things. We refer to our PhDs and our studies and other observations. So this is going to go quite into depth. And as I mentioned to you before we started, I don't think we will be able to cover the breadth of identity. It's a huge issue. Whether it's talking about Muslims or the societal members per se. So here, what as I've mentioned, I actually did chapter 3 was on British Muslims and identity. My entire, as I said, I dedicated an entire chapter to that in my PhD, and I mentioned here, referring to someone that I like to reference a lot, A.R. Renani, and he refers to another academic, Castells, where they've mentioned here in summarizing identity. Identity as a relative concept should be seen as a combination of individual experience with association of several factors such as historical roots, geographical environment, educational and political systems, economic consumption, religious understanding, practices, and beliefs. And I don't want to labor on that particular definition that they've given there, because there are many. But one of the things that I find that we as Muslims in the West, and I want to tease out if it happens in the East as well, we restrict identity to religious understanding, practices, and beliefs first and foremost. Previously, before I would say the more traditional communities, especially in the UK, they refer to cultural and nationalistic identity markers, and I believe that's still relevant for many today. But the focus is and has been for a while now, I would say at least for the last 30 years, on religious understanding, practices, and beliefs. And I think that in doing that, we are restricting ourselves somewhat. What do I mean by that? You and I have had back and forths, and we've discussed what's happening in America, George Floyd, these incidents, which are these individuals not Muslim, okay? And there's been a difference between the Muslims, whether to subscribe and support and have empathy for what happened to the wider black population, of which you and I are part, or by virtue of the fact that they are non-Muslim, that this isn't relevant to us. We should just be looking at Islam. And if we look at the identity definition that's been given here, we have to consider our individual experiences, several factors such as historical roots in the US, in the UK, the geographical environment that we're within, educational and political systems, all of which affect us. So restricting it just to religion as a Muslim, which is it's part of a whole, it's part of the mosaic, I think is important. And I think that as Muslims, we are doing ourselves a disservice and we're limiting ourselves. And I'm not saying Islam is limited. I'm talking about the environment that we're in. We end up marginalizing ourselves to an extent, or limiting the scope of who we are and what we can do when we are focusing solely through the lens, the prism, not prison, prism
Yep.
of religion.
Right.
Mashallah. So so I'll read this one more time, Khalid, so you can get the if I might have
I don't, it's good. I understand it. And I think that that was a launching pad. I think you know, I think it's imperative that, again, it comes down, you know, it's terminologies, and it's how we articulate these things. The way I see it is that, you know, obviously, and I think you would agree, the Muslim identity, that is the number one. Okay.
Right.
Yes, we are from various nationalities, nations, and tribes, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in nations and tribes, so that way we get to know one another and not despise one another. So we do have various cultural backgrounds and so forth, and we are not practicing our Islam in a void. You know, there is a context from our culture and the issues that we deal with in our communities. So someone who comes from a disadvantaged community, or a person who has more means, they come from a more middle class or upper middle class or whatever, you know, all of those things have an effect on their identity and who they are, even as Muslims. But I think it's always so imperative to keep that Muslim identity absolutely in the forefront, and to use it. I don't see that, yes, it is a prism, but I think it's very important to keep that prism, because once we lose that, then this is the problem of what we see from many people, is they do lose their Muslim identity and they subvert it to all those other things. The Syrians are Syrians. That's how they look at them. So whether they're Muslim or whatever, they see themselves as a unified Syrian community. There are those amongst them that are religious and see themselves in a broader context. But our experiences over the many, many years of dealing with many of our brothers and sisters from various, migrant communities in the West, I can speak about, especially in America, is we found that there are those who are, you know, it was very important for them, that diehard Islamic identity, and that being forced and foremost, because that was what allowed us to strengthen our ties. Because if you keep those prisms, and those prisms are, you know, you keep that view, and it's too narrow and it's restricted and focused on your identity, your national identity or whatever, ethnic identity, and this and that and the other, that's where you basically you begin to lose your Islam, you know, and you lose those ties. Because I don't have a ties with Syrians, except for that they're the Syrians that are my Muslim brothers. And, you know, I've traveled to Syria and I've seen, you know, it's a beautiful country and this and that and the other. But that is, you know, our perspective is a bit different as reverts, in that we had our own cultures and communities and societies that we kind of left, and we were very conscious in forcefully going to that Muslim identity. And that's why, you know, you have the zealousness. You know, we opened Bukhari, you know, how many, you know, brothers, I read that in Bukhari, this is it. You know, that's the word. Akhi, what are you doing? I remember once a fight broke out, unfortunately, in one of the masajid, and actually it was a Jamaican revert, I believe. And, you know, we came in the masjid at Fajr. He was sleeping in the masjid because the doors used to be open. He was listening to Bob Marley. And anyhow, we come in at Fajr, this guy's listening to Bob Marley. So it escalated, obviously. And one of my beloved brothers, you know, the guy got a couple shots in. Well, that wasn't gonna fly. So I followed them both out down the few blocks. My brother took care of his business in the street. But my point is, but I remember when they were fighting in the masjid, one of the elders, he was just like, the Quran said, brother, that when the two parties of imam that they get into the dispute, you're supposed to fight one of them. So kill him. I mean, literally, you know, it was so literal, you know, and that's what I mean. There's that zealousness, and that is because we left and consciously left our communities and our identities. Now, I'm not saying that it was all good, because some of us distanced to a total level, not all of us, but many of us, you know, it became that Muslim identity, because it's like, hey, this is what's going to get me to paradise. It isn't that the aspects of the Black Panther Party is not going to bring my salvation if you were active with that, or, you know, those kind of movements, or your family was, or whatever, or, you know, the nation, or whatever ideologies and you know, and the cultural things. So I think, you know, I think there's a balance that needs to take place, but I very much see, without getting off topic, it's so important to always keep the Muslim identity first. And I know there's a lot of push now, and maybe pushback from certain people in the West, especially, you know, maybe some African Americans and some Afro Canadians and stuff like this, who are saying, you know, my Black identity first, and even some Somalis and others are joining in that call. You know, I'm Black first. This is what they see first. Yeah, the police are not seeing me as a Salafi when they pull me over, but at the same time, my identity, my Muslim identity, that comes first and foremost, and that defines all of those other relationships. And that's why I think it's always imperative to keep that. You have to keep it first.
I think that's key what you're saying. I agree. I think that's a very key point.
So let me mention one thing, because also there comes sometimes a cultural arrogance that is defined by being born Muslim. I've known and seen many scenarios and heard of them and witnessed them where people thought that, you know, as a revert, you're not a legitimate Muslim, you know, that you are really a kafir. I know a brother, in Sardiya, he was teaching English to the youth in Qasim. He was in Qasim, you know, and you know how Qasim is, it's very stern. And when he came in the classroom, and it's also known for a lot of Takfiri, as a Takfiri region, and, you know, a lot of Takfiri ideologies there. A lot of those guys are from there. Anyhow, when he came in the classroom, he was going to teach children or what have you. They literally began chanting in unison, kafir, 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 kafir. And he was just like, what? He was blown away. And then he asked them, because that's what their fathers were teaching them. He's American. He's not a Muslim. He's a kafir, you know? And so there's a lot of, that's because of the identity is not for a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, is not Islam first. For them, it was Saudi, Qasimi, and whatever their tribes were. You know, that becomes so important. So no, we don't throw away identity, but it has to be governed by Islam and the Sharia.
I think some very key points to unpack there, and mashallah, tabarakallah, our brothers and sisters have made some very good points, which I'm going to ask Hassan to bring back it shortly. First, wa alaikum salam to Sister Shireen, Sister Octavia. We've had others who've just come on, some of our regular brothers and sisters, mashallah, welcome. What I think is important is that the Muslim identity has to be first for converts, for Muslims. Those who are born Muslims, this is important. And you touched upon terminology, and I think there's something that we need to look at as well, which I've been having some discussions and after reading an article a few weeks ago by a Muslim. And for us as converts, you use the term revert, I use the term convert. I was asked this by a non-Muslim American on a recent podcast that I did. And bridging the gap, mashallah, one new Muslim individual and another one non-Muslim, both basketball coaches. And I lean more to the term convert, because revert, if we, and I'm not dismissing revert, if we look at the term revert, and we know we're basing it on the hadith that we were all born upon our fitra and everything like this.
Yeah.
But then when we look at the term revert, the psychological construct that we develop is that we've returned to the religion, but we were never upon the religion in our cognizant lifetime. Okay. We're not returning to anything except our fitra, which we need to redefine, reconfigure. Okay. So convert is when you embrace something new. Okay. And your cognitive your cognitive development is one you are choosing after guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're moving in a path deliberately. Now, if we, and you might say, okay, and I'm not going to split hairs on this. I think I'm okay with others who use it interchangeably, but I'm looking at it from a perspective of identity and what it can do for the psychological construct of individuals. Like, well, I'm just returning back to my religion, because I've seen those of us who were converts, and we look at my 4 cognitive stages in my theoretical framework, there is often a haughtiness, an arrogance, and a disdain for those who are culturally and heritage-wise Muslims from birth, their parents and everything like that. And us who are coming back in, like, we're reverts. We'll even bring the narration that Allah will replace those who are not practicing, not good, with those who are better. And even the heritage-based Muslims, the culturally based Muslims, use that. And I think that at this point can be problematic when it provides that psychological construct for those who move and traverse that path that I've just described. You may not have done that. I may not have done that. Maybe we did. Our overzealousness, according to those first 2 formative stages, led us to believe that, like, oh, we're reconnecting, and we're reconnecting stronger than those who've been practicing all the time. So we need to teach them the religion. So this is one aspect of identity, I think, that when we're looking at terminology, we need to be very aware of, should I say. But moving to what you were saying with regards to the deen being first and foremost, I agree with you on that as well. What I would say, though, is that we need to make sure that that's tempered with not having an identity transformation in which we become unrecognizable to ourselves in those areas that we needn't change. Giving up alcohol, illicit lifestyles, not fraternizing with particular company or frequenting particular places.
Holidays.
All of that we move to the side. But what we're seeing, and you and I have spoken about this before, for converts, particularly reverts, if you like, Arabizing our identities, choosing the more predominant culture and trying to assimilate into that culture, whether it's South Asian, whether it's Arab, whether it's African, North African, Central African, Eastern African, and we are not from there. That again is a problem so far as identity construct is concerned. So these elements, the societies that we are in, that we have embraced or we have participated in, and they have become an intrinsic part of our character, that should still be a part of us, but with the influence of Islam therefore shaping these other areas, Islam being the reference point to all of these other pre-existing characteristics of our identities that are conducive with the religion.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't really have much to add to that, but I think, as you said, it's about keeping all those things in check. The rush for assimilation, to realize, and again, that's as you mentioned, in those stages of development of choosing and growing into our identities as Muslims, in the very stages of that, for a lot of us, it was, or some of us, and especially those of us who went overseas and had that experience, that, there was a lot of assimilation. Like when I came from Yemen, I was completely, when I came back to America, you would never catch me without a sort of an imamah, but the way Yemeni style. I could tie that. You could just give me a thing, and I boom, I'd have that tied. Now I can't even really tie it anymore, but and I would wear izar. We're out selling oils and incense and doing whatever we did in our izar. That was very much, that identity we were grabbing onto, and there was good in that. And I think it's about the balance of not the pressure to do that, and to necessarily take on another cultural identity, and because those are a part of looking like a Muslim as well. You know what I mean? Looking, something that the people can identify you as a Muslim. But we see both extremes. We see people who have no concern, they don't want to identify as a Muslim hardly. Then we have those who want to identify with particular cultures which are not theirs, like to such an extent. And I'll give you an example. I know an African-American brother that he is so entrenched with the Indian Pakistani community, and that's probably where I think he told me that he was from the nation initially, or I mean, his father was raised in the nation, was a big nation guy in the local thing, and maybe he embraced Islam, or maybe his father did as well. But his experience, and he even married from that region, with Indo-Pak. So he's all these years, always still with a shalwar kameez. And I used to always wear shalwar kameez before I went overseas and kind of became Arabized, if you will. But but it's not just that, but so much so. I mean, he is he's got good manners. He's so quiet. He's a very good brother. But I've actually, and I was just like, wow, he actually does what is common in Indian from some of the expressions. He moves his head like, does this. I'm dead serious, So you can see where the mixing and the identity that, there can be those extremes, where you can,
Absolutely.
and I don't know. I mean, when you're around whatever a particular people, if I'm around the Yemenis, of course, I'm going to learn expressions. I had many expressions and still ways and things that I do that are effect of my experience in Yemen, especially, and obviously Saudi, because I spent so many years there too. But the Yemenis, they're very distinct in some of their cultural practices, and it's different and raw. But anyhow, I think it's very important to keep that balance. I think a problem for some of us as converts or reverts, because I only just started using reverts as a term because it's become so common. But one of the things is when we are so conscious to run from our culture, run from things that we could learn and benefit from. And I'll give you another example. The same brother, may Allah forgive us in him and bless us in him. Not that the one in India, but the one who had the experience in Qasim. I remember he visited me in Medina, and I had my bookshelves, and on the bottom bookshelf, and I told you about this before, I know I've related this, but on the bottom bookshelf, I had a lot of my secular books, which are a lot of African-American history books and stuff like this, autobiography, Malcolm X, books, Marcus Garvey speeches, all this stuff from my that's a part of my identity and so forth. So, I had those books there. They were all my Islamic books are above them. And I remember when he came in and he said, "You still have that black stuff?" He's African-American too. And I said, "Well, I'm still black. I don't know what happened. It's still there." So, I cracked up, but there's something more to it in what he was saying, in that I think a lot of us, even myself, especially after going to Yemen, there was a conscious discarding of a lot of our cultural identity, and even things that might be good or, that are mubah, that are permissible. But, we were fleeing so much and so much striving to be like a new culture that we embraced, depending on who you're around. If you're around Yemenis, if you're around Pakistani, if you're around this Gambians, you're going to, kind of sort of assimilate into their cultural schemes and dress and way of doing things and food and everything else, which is not a problem. But I think, when it's so conscious and when it's a belittlement of your past culture, and you end up missing a lot of things. There's a lot of missing, and a lot of you become out of touch. Me living overseas so much, I realize so much now being back, how out of touch I am with the society in general, and even specifically, I would say the trenches in my community. You know, I've been so far away from that. I've been in a whole,
but
my bubble, my reality is so different. And living in Yemen with the Yemeni Shabab, you know, and the students of knowledge, and going to the study circles, or being in Saudi, and just, you know, I was a part of those circles, you know. We're coming from different parts of the country to study ilm, and, you know, you're with the scholars, and, you know, it's just your whole reality, your whole thinking and lifestyle is very different.
I think that, and absolutely, and an apex predator mentioned something and referred to the hadith of the blacksmith and the muscle, fantastic narration. Jazakallah khair, apex predator, for highlighting this. You're upon the deen of your friends. You become influenced by the company that you're with, and this is talking about character in that particular instance. But I think it's pertinent that he's raised that, because you do become part, or you do get influenced by the predominant or the more dominant culture or race that you're amongst. As you said, your friend who's been influenced by the Indian idiosyncrasies or cultural aspects, if you like. We know that Black culture is pervasive in the urban societies across the world. How many white middle class youth and elsewhere are speaking with Black slang and lingo and everything like this, hip hop music, and what's coming through from that basic, the Jamaican slang that's being used across the West and everything. So sorry,
across the East and the West is, so there's Moroccan rappers, there's Jeddah rappers, there's everything.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So that's good. Red Tiger's mentioning something here about tolerating different sects. You're already very few. Very pertinent point, and we'll touch upon that in more detail. Maybe not today, Red Tiger. We've touched on it before, but we will go and elucidate upon the areas of this. But I want to go back again, when we're looking, Sister Shama, wa alaikum salam, Sister Shama made a very important point. And if Hassan, you can put that last point post up from Sister Shama, when Muslim identity is understood, putting it first with ikhlas, in sincerity, is so humbling. Hatred, racism, and jealousy gets minimized. And one of the things that's key there, the key word, and I think that's a good acknowledgement from Sister Shama, it gets minimized. Let's not talk idealistic now, that idealistically that it gets removed, because we saw even amongst the Sahaba, there were issues there. We have a famous narration regarding Bilal and what happened there. So this is important, that the understanding of Muslim identity, but not only understanding it from the point of ikhlas and removing hatred and racism among ourselves. Let's put it back in the wider context, the macro context of the societies that we're living in. And I've been discussing more recently aspects of my PhD where I've referred to identity constructs in the societies that we live in. So, for example, many in the West, many in all societies, have what I would identify, using the terminology, as a legitimized identity. What does that mean? Governments have social control mechanisms and strategies. And in those social control mechanisms and strategies, the end result for them is to obtain a desired behavior of the masses. So the policies, it might be free healthcare, it might be free education, it might be a number of things that the society can subscribe to. And by subscribing to that, those social control mechanisms then yield a particular type of identity, a legitimized identity, if you like, law-abiding citizens. Okay, now the vast majority of Muslims are part of that legitimized identity in whichever society that we're leading in and we are living in, and we know that there are edicts and everything about that, about how we should abide in the societies that we're in. We know in the Muslim societies that it should be at the extreme. There should be no khuruj, as we know what the takfiris, the kharijis refer to and what they adhere to and call for. You've got the polar opposite of that, okay, which is a resistance identity. And this is an interesting point now. The resistance identity is when you've become disillusioned with the state, with particular policies, or the way that they've been behaving. And we see that in Western societies. We've seen that in Hong Kong. We saw that in France more recently. We've seen that in the UK. We saw it in America, where protest then becomes an element. And that doesn't mean they're completely resistant identities, but they're upset with the status quo over particular policies. Okay. I've asked a question. By virtue of being a Muslim and what we stand for, while we're adhering to society and societal norms on the whole, isn't it by the very fact that we are Muslims placing us in that construct as resistance identities? And it's a tricky question, because some might be saying, oh, he's saying we're revolting against society. No, we know that the Western societies as they stand are, if they're not antithetical to Islam, they are afraid and have put in policies to constrain or place constraints upon Islam. Okay, because if they don't do that, they're going to fear an Islamic growth and Islamic influence and everything like that, which they talk about now. So do we as Muslims have elements of a resistance identity? And is that mixed with aspects of the legitimized law-abiding identity? I would say it is. And I've only given two constructs here. It's not binary, there are more, but I've only given two. This comes from S.R.A. Renani's typology, and I will go through some of that if there's enough time to show what sort of identity constructs exist upon us in the West. So what do you think of that? Given those two definitions I've given, the legitimized identity, law-abiding citizen, which we are on the whole, but by virtue of being Muslim, there's an element of resistance identity, because we don't accord or subscribe to everything the Western societies are asking us to subscribe to.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a tension, as you said. There's an element of both in being abiding, not Biden, but that there's always going to be that tension. And I think also we have to look at the nuances of the Muslim community, the varieties of, as we've talked about before, the progressive, for them, khalas, it's okay. Right. Assimilation totally. And just, push for certain policies. So we have so much diversity in the Muslim community, and in ideologies, and in Aqidah, creed, and groups and sects who take a different approach in dealing with life as a Muslim minority, because that is in and of itself, I'd say there's no doubt there's an element of compromise. I mean, it is what it is. Especially those of us who are from these societies that, that's where my mother, that's where my grandmother, and that's where I'm from. I don't have another place that's necessarily opening arms for me. So this is the society I'm from. But, there is that tension of being a Muslim minority, all the challenges that come with that. So what I would say in short is there's always going to be that tension. And that comes to dealing with the political system as well. As in my chapter, my fourth chapter in my PhD, it's called Salafi Perceptions of Western Societies. So that was the whole chapter. So I actually had a chapter dealing with that, talking about the issue of democracy, and that, Salafi scholars as a whole, I don't know any Salafi scholars that legitimize or don't speak very harshly against democracy at the same time. And so us as students and others who are adhering to that minhaj, that I think there's that tension, but it's probably the lesser of the evils. We wouldn't want to be, and the scholars even distinguish between living in a communist society versus a Western democratic society or what have you. They talk about the hypocrisies and the hypocrisy and the contradictions. But so all of those ailments, I think we end up navigating through it by default, and it just depends upon our participation in those societies, what we feel is legitimate. Some of those groups, Ikhwan Muslimin or or those influenced by that type of ideology or what have you, and others like the Sufi, that are sort of semi-progressive and traditionals like Hamza Yusuf and stuff, totally take a role in that, in the societies. I mean, Hamza Yusuf and some of those guys, those Sufis, they have big stages. They are in the U.S. Congress praying and leading the prayer over the Democrats and Republicans and stuff like this. So, there's various approaches, and that speaks to the diversity in the community, and what you think is legitimate to be able to do, and how to navigate in these societies as Muslim minorities.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that I think it's a good thing that the Muslim communities can participate at varying levels of society, as we must. I think that's essential. But I want to go back to a point. Peter Sayers just mentioned the point about us having a louder voice. That's one thing, and I think that's a very important thing. A louder, unified voice. You and I have discussed this before, Khalid, the various levels of we operate in and function in the society, and that there should be a unitary voice around areas that we can agree. Okay, cooperate together upon righteousness. But then Matteo mentions he brings a good example, and if Hassan can raise that as well. And I want to add to what Matteo has just put there with regards to how Musa alayhi salam interacted with Pharaoh, and saying Islam has made major contributions to Western societies. It has done. So we are both resistant and in conformity. Very interesting. You've said the similar to Musa confronting Pharaoh, because the Bani Israel existed in those societies. Yes, they were at the lower strata, and they were more of a service provider in those instances, but they maintained the infrastructure. And I don't want to juxtapose it and say similar to the slaves in the transatlantic slavery, but we know that Africans built America. And we're not talking about, and we can include economically, but we were a free source of labor. So there was that foundation aspect there. But I would go and bring another example, Matteo, which may be more pertinent. And that is the example of Yusuf alayhi salam, because Yusuf contributed to the society he was in, which was a non-Muslim society. And he was elevated to the rank of wazir, and basically ruler of the land. There's huge socio-economic impact where the adjoining regions had to come to him. So there was participation in society as well. So, but by virtue of his faith, did that make him part of a resistance identity there? That's for another day, because the fact he was in such a high position to influence policy, to influence direction, maybe he did not need a resistance identity in the same way that we see with the Najashi of Abyssinia, who invited in the fledgling community with the first mini Hijra. When he became Muslim, he was at the very peak of power. So that wasn't a resistance identity. There was nothing to resist. He was the one who implemented law, implemented policy. We see with Caesar as well. Had he taken his Shahada, there's discussion that the entire peoples would have followed him in that. So when you're in such influential positions, there's no resistance identity. You are the one who influences identity. You are the one who shapes identity. But coming back to what Matteo's saying, if we're coming from a perspective where we are the ones who are subjected or subject to social control of the governments and powers that be, we can, as Matteo said, as you've highlighted, we can be both resistance, according to the constructs I've just given, and we can be legitimized as well. And I think that interrelatedness is very, very important for us to acknowledge, because we have Muslims who go into extreme uzla, isolation, completely withdrawing from society, which in the context that we're living in today shines a lens upon us as being extreme. When we and also those of us who pull our communities away from the wider society and the facilities that are there, and we are not equipped to replace those facilities So we will pull our children out of schools because of the curriculum and everything. And yes, the curriculum is a problem. But instead of going as a unified group of parents, okay, we don't go in and influence the mainstream education. We say we're going to start our own schools, and many of us have been successful in that. But what about those who haven't? And they've said, right, we can't do these schools successfully because we do not have the skill set amongst our brothers and sisters. So then what happens is we remove our children from society. Then we place them, say we're going to do homeschooling. Our wives, and many of us as husbands, mothers and fathers, are not equipped or qualified to teach our children and equip them. And I'm saying the Islamic knowledge as well as the secular or academic knowledge. So then what happens? We ghettoize our communities. So it's really important, coming back to what we initially discussed, Khalid, it's really important that these other aspects of our identity are enshrined by Islam. And when we see that maybe there's a deficiency in an element there educationally, there's a deficiency in there educationally or from the skill set, Islam should be the empowering aspect of our personality, of our identity, that makes us raise the standards of these other elements of our identity that are deficient and have been deficient since coming to the deen. What do you think of that?
That's a, I was kind of in a few places with the with what you were just saying, and I was really kind of fixated on what we discussed prior, that again, it's about determining parameters as far as our involvement in the society. Okay, it needs to be clear Islamic parameters. And this is one of the things we lack. A lot of people say, no, just run for governor and just do this. But honestly, and I don't believe, honestly, the changes and even the steps forward those are steps forward in assimilation. Those are not step forwards in transformation.
Right.
That's the reality, because you have to play. You're not going to go into Congress. What's her name? Ilhad, Ilham, and the other one, and Omar. I forget her first name. No. Anyway, the Palestinian and the Somali sister. Okay, they give it's an identity thing, and it's an identity but there's no Islamic change that they can really provide. They have to, even if they buck the system, they're not just demonized and so forth, but there's really not much. Those kind of roles and so forth are maybe out of a absolute, should I say, maybe a necessity to play a role or something, the lesser of the evils. But the problem is a lot of those individuals, they look at that as the means to all. Yeah, I'm a Muslim, the first Muslim congressman or congresswoman, and I'm going to do this and do that. And they really usually themselves have very little Islamic identity themselves. And we see the transgressions that they do and they end up doing. And so this is, so I don't think it is even proper to necessarily look at Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam and other examples of the prophets alayhim afdal salatu wasalam, except that we follow Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because his sunnah is what we're ordered to follow. As we know, the athar of Umar, he was reading some of the Torah, and the Prophet ﷺ became very angry, and it said if Musa was alive, he would be following me. So,
but can I interject there?
Wait, let me finish. So, I'm saying that we cannot use, unless someone, okay, he's a doctor, he's a politician, he becomes Muslim. That's different. But for us to strive to have those things when we already know the game. We know the game. Yeah, Obama was a brown-skinned president, black president, whatever. But there's nothing he did for the African-American community, okay? What makes you think a Muslim who is now ruling by laws other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shara is going to really do in those roles, except for it's going to look good. Now, if the president becomes Muslim, that's different. That's great. He's in that role. He's now embraced Islam, alhamdulillah. But for the Muslim to strive to get in those roles where they have to play a whole system and work through a whole system, which requires them to assimilate really at every stage of the game, just about, and model their beliefs and compromise the Sharia and maybe totally contradict the Sharia to get there. No. And using Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam and Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, they were abiding by a different Sharia. Okay,
I think you misunderstood. I want
to finish up that Muhammad sallallahu. No, that is not what we saw. We didn't see him saying, let me take a big position with the Quraysh and reform it from there. Let's reform the. No, he was pretty much pure and forceful in calling the Tawheed, and I think that is really our role. That we don't have to be. There's the Amish that are still respected. They're not really looked at extremism, as extremists like that, and others. And we don't have to be like the Amish, but there are lessons we can learn from them. I
think you misunderstood what I was saying from those examples, Khalid, because
no, I'm not saying necessarily that you're saying that. But I'm just saying
I'm not saying political participation is one thing. What I'm saying in that instance, and what I mean is, if we are able to participate at the various levels in society that we are at, then there is nothing wrong in doing that. I'm not saying seeking office or anything like that. That's one thing. I think we need to be clear on that. But by the same instance, I'm not saying, you've mentioned the Amish. What we've seen too much is that withdrawal from society. And yes, we have to call to Tawheed. This is the condition of our dawah. We have to call to Tawheed. But when we pull back in the way and we say, okay, we are going to limit the level of participation, if we see that there are doors open, and I'm not saying that the doors open up right now, you must go for election, you must do such a, no, we're not talking about that. But if called upon to engage, and I know this from speaking with Sheikh Rabi' when I was in Makkah, Sheikh Wasiallah, when I sat with him privately in his home and everything, and I said, look, I'm being called at these levels to explain from my PhD studies about counter-radicalization and everything like this. And Sheikh Wasiallah said that if there's no one else doing it, especially from amongst the Salafis, then it's wajib upon you to do this. So I'm saying from those, I didn't think, oh, I'm going to run for office, I'm going to change the world or whatever. Yeah. But purely from the perspective of being a proof or establishing a proof of the efficacy of Islam at these levels, whether they take it or not, that I think is important. Being visible in that way, while holding on to deen, not like what you're saying with Ilham and others, while holding on to deen. Okay,
yeah, absolutely. We're on the same page in that. Then, I think it needed to be clarified for the listeners, because some people will pick from that and say, "Oh yeah, Dr. Abdul Haqq says," or not that, but they'll follow from that.
Right.
Very important. Start charitable organizations. What if we had a powerful charity that is making a change here in New Mexico and in our communities? That would be powerful to have Islam in a position of power as something that's contributed to the society. That's great, because that's a form of dawah. So there are many ways I think that we haven't explored yet. So I'm with that.
Exactly.
So I think
the example of Yusuf, alayhi salam, was from a perspective of being in a non-Muslim society, but being at a level where we're talking about identity constructs. He didn't need to have the two. Okay, because he was the influencer at the top, at the helm. Najashi was the influencer at the helm. Caesar, who remained non-Muslim, was the so social control, not that they would have implemented it in the way that we know today. Social control would have come from, it always comes from the top, not from the bottom. Okay, and if there isn't a subscription from the bottom to that, it becomes resistance in that particular way. So, for example, when we look at the example of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if we're bringing those constructs, which I'm very shy to do, then we will see that by virtue of becoming Muslim, that there were resistance identities coming up which were obligatory upon those who embraced the religion. And we see that toppled an entire civilization from the Quraysh. Tawheed was established and Islam was made prevalent in that regard. So what's important, Khalid, I think it's a really good discussion, is that as we're navigating Muslim identity in the West, one of the things I hope is clear here, and has been highlighted and endorsed by some of the participants who are looking, that yes, we can be law-abiding citizens, but we have to note that by virtue of us being Muslims, we cannot dilute those aspects that are in conflict with the societies that we're living in. So by virtue of that, we will have resistance identities or elements of resistance identities by virtue of the fact that we are Muslims. And so the assimilation which you're speaking about, there are elements here where I've got some typologies here which refers to those Muslims who want to assimilate, even changing their name. Muhammad becomes Ed. Aisha sheds the name and becomes Julie or Tracy or Jemima or whatever. This is assimilation, and because of embarrassment, weakness, lack of knowledge, insecurity, or being ashamed of the Muslim heritage, religious side of your identity. And that cannot be. And the only way that you can hold on to that identity construct as a Muslim is to continually learn about it, have knowledge of yourself as a Muslim. And that without that, one of the participants mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if it's Apex Muslim or one of the others, that mentioned that the non-Muslims, they respect those, especially Muslims, who hold on to their Muslim identity. We've seen that Shaitan, for example, we know that Iblis, once he gets you to lose or sin in a particular way, shirk, or he gets you so far into that, he leaves you. We have to understand that the non-Muslim society is similar. Once they've coaxed the female, the fairer sex, as they call them, to move in a way that is more in line with Western values, excuse me, dating, boyfriends, multiple boyfriends, leaving their husbands, women's rights, this aggressive feminism. Once they've got them there, and the sister has moved away from her disposition as a Muslimah and how she's been protected as a Muslimah, they leave you. Just like the man who, like we've seen with the Quilliam, they jumped into bed, metaphorically speaking, with the West to say, we are with you. Our identity is more in line with you. We don't like these Muslims. These Muslims are extreme. Nearly everyone they labeled was extreme except themselves. And then we saw that the non-Muslim society gobbled them up and spat them out with no respect, because they'd left something that is so fundamentally pure, so fundamentally strong, so fundamentally overarching, that they said, if we can do this and these Muslims can leave, as we've seen by those who've gone into the West and assimilated, we don't have to worry about them anymore, and we've got no respect for them. And if you look amongst that cohort of Muslims, you'll see psychological problems, mental health issues, not schizophrenia, but them not knowing who they are, because where they ran to, hoping they would be embraced, was very superficial. And when they look back, they realize how much of their Muslim identity they've shed, and that was the greater part of them. So I think that if anything comes from this, we need to be really clear that it's okay to have that opposing construct, so long as your Islamic identity is the one shaping the others within the context of the societies that you live in.
Yeah.
Well, see, we were on the same page, Khalid. I wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It's there's going to be those tensions, and as we've discussed before, and I emphasize in my research, because like I said, Salafi perceptions of Western society. So there's even, because there is a sort of an insular nature that is, of course, in our literature. I mean, from the classical scholars up until now, the push Islamically is predominantly on hijrah and to be with the Muslims. And there's many reasons for that. And we know the complexities of our societies in the world now. So these are challenges. And the reality of the Muslims is there's going to be those who, a lot of people who are not making hijrah. Like, it was very interesting. I was in a khutbah and it was a Deobandi masjid, you know, because I couldn't pray in my regular place I would pray in. And the imam, he said, we're not going anywhere. That was what was really interesting. He's actually from South Africa, and most of the congregants are from, you know, Pakistan and India and so forth. But he said, we're not going anywhere. But again, they're losing their children as well and their identity. But that was kind of interesting to me, what he had to say in that perspective. And that's kind of the reality for a lot of people. So there's that, you know, there's always going to be that tension is all I can say on that. There's always going to be that tension, and finding what roles and what parameters, what we can do, how do we navigate in a society that, you know, a non-Muslim society where we are in the role of Muslim minorities. You know, we have to ask our, you know, for a lot of us, ask permission to pray, or to pray Jumu'ah. You know, oh, I'm going to pray for 5 minutes. I'll be right back in 5 minutes. You know, it's a very that's not a strong position. You know, plain and simple, is not a strong position. And I am finding that myself now, being back in the society and working in a non-Muslim environment, you know, where that's the case. And then, you know, there's a lot of compromise. It's just plain and simple. There's no other way to talk about it except that it's compromise. And I had some interesting quotes here. See if I can come across it really quickly. Actually, from you, I interviewed you when we had a discussion about some of these issues about the hijrah and so forth. And I also interviewed another close, matter of fact, here it is, Perspectives of Hijrah, Dr. Baker. Let's see what we said. And this was about migration in the Muslim. So I transcribed what I interviewed, what I got from you. And I said, what I said is, within the Salafi communities in the West, there's been a paradigm shift, with many Salafis no longer emphasizing migration from non-Muslim countries to Muslim countries. Baker observes, I remember when I was new on the deen as a Salafi, there was a lot of talk about hijrah to the land of the Muslims to study, to work, and stuff like that. I think with the generation that has been here, that now knows and has actualized their deen in a more comprehensive way, theoretical learning and then abstract enhances their insight by seeing the deen, being more experienced and mature on the deen, gives them new perspectives. I think that has happened with many who came out and lived in the Middle East. The actualizing has not only showed us how to live a more Islamic life, but that we are being a more religious than thou beforehand, being overzealous, that we were being a more religious than thou beforehand. Anyhow, you know, again, there's that tension, there's that, you know, and finding our identity in the West, navigating, especially because for the masses, you know, most people, they have to work in non-Muslim immersed environments, you know, you know, there are those who work in the community. And so they have that strong community. If you're working in a Muslim school, so everyone's Muslim, and the manners can be, you know, and the prayer, there's no issue. But for most people in the West, most Muslims as Muslim minorities, they are, you know, there's subjected to a lot of compromise. So, you know, there's always going to be that tension, and there's that difficulty with that. And in the end of the day, ittaqullah mastata'tum, fear Allah as much as you can. You know,
very good point. But I feel that there's those tensions there, and what we need to do is not become comfortable with it, but acknowledge it and develop our identities in such a way that how we traverse society is comfortable for everyone. That doesn't mean compromising, though. It means this is who we are. Like, I remember when I went back to the UK, and it was the first time I'd gone back for Eid to spend with family. My children all went, my wife and everything. And when I saw how visible the Eid was, it hadn't been like that. Because I love to spend my Eid and Ramadan in Saudi. I've living there, as you know, up until last year. And I just didn't want to be anywhere else, because there's no atmosphere or environment quite like Eid in the land of the Muslims, mashallah, tabarakallah, especially Saudi. Now, when I saw the non-Muslims' attention to what was taking place visibly in the parks, it was a beautiful day and everything, it was amazing. My heart leapt. I was like, alhamdulillah that I'm seeing this. And non-Muslims were coming up to us in the park and what is this? Can we, we're interested. And we said, look, come, food is being served over there. Come and have a drink and get a chicken, a piece of chicken or a sandwich or whatever it was, an ice cream. And so that was beautiful. And that wasn't just in one area. When I was traveling through London, you just saw the visibility of the Muslims, the pride of the Muslims, the unity of the Muslims. And I think that's what I'm talking about, that we need to own our identities a lot more. And Hassan, if you can put up what Sister Shama said, because I think this epitomizes the point that we're talking about. Sister Shama said a quote from Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu an, I fear the day when the disbelievers are proud of their falsehood and the Muslims are shy of their faith. And we are seeing that across the West, even in some of the lands of the Muslims, where we're seeing that pride in the disbelief and speaking against Islam. And instead of resisting it in a nuanced way, you got the takfiris who will go in the way they're going because they have an anger and a zeal like we all do, but theirs is displayed in a distorted way. You'll see most of the Muslims, or not most, but many Muslims either remain silent, are too shy, or are too embarrassed to show and display and speak of their faith and the beauty and the efficacy of our faith in that instance. So Jazakallah khair, Sister Shama, once again, I think this is an amazing quote that's been placed. But Khalid, what I want to do before we draw to a close, and I'm not going to dwell on this too long, I want to share with our participants, our audience, that we've just spoken about a few constructs, okay? I had to look at this in detail. And even what I've got here doesn't encapsulate the different identity challenges that we've got. Yes, Majestic Hero Prince, thank you for your contribution today. But yes, Islam makes sense. It does. It makes perfect sense, mashallah, tabarakallah. But so I looked at some other typologies of identity. And Renani, again, I'm going to refer to another. He referred to the nationalist identity, okay, where particular dress codes, social etiquettes, that are distinct from the majority of society are adhered to. Then there's the traditional identity. This group constitutes a high proportion of the elder generation. We know who've come from Pakistan or from South Asia in that instance. The Islamist identity, that political aspect, we know we've discussed that before. The modernized identity, modernism. This group includes individuals who attempt to adapt to the prevailing dominant cultural and social cultural environment. Okay, modern interpretations of religious concepts are often sought to reconcile some of the disparities between faith and social dictates. The progressives, in that instance. The secular identity, secularism. We know there are Muslims who exist within this particular identity construct as well. And the anglicized Western Muslim. Okay, they are those who have assimilated into culture and fully immersed themselves into the norms, celebrations, and customs of society. This is a construct that we must avoid and resist at all costs. Because in this one is where what you pointed to earlier, identity, Muslim identity, is completely lost. Okay, if maintained at all. Then we have a hybrid identity. Okay, this is and I discussed this in many of the presentations that I've given, where Renani describes this group that there's an absence of any distinct identity. Okay, they're influenced by two major factors: religious and cultural roots. Okay, I won't go into. And I've got Nielsen's typology here that I looked at, Shepard's typology, Tariq Ramadan's typology. What I'm trying to show, and the last one here from Renani, is the undetermined identity or vagrant identity. He says this group consists of a young generation that is not inclined to any particular direction or identity, irrespective of whether it's cultural or traditional. We need to look at our youth because many of them have this identity. And many of them, when they're looking at traditional identities, assimilated identities, they don't want that. And as you've seen in my PhD, I talk about a pendulum swing effect. And if they see that there's a politicized identity that speaks more to them on the other end of the spectrum compared to the traditionalist, let's say, assimilated identity, basically, they will swing. The pendulum never stops in the middle. It always swings to the other extreme. So our youth, second, third, fourth, fifth generations that are emerging in our societies, that undetermined identity is a very vulnerable identity, and it's important for us to know our identity and how to navigate our Muslim identities with the other aspects of our identity in order to direct them, in order to nurture them, in order to be role models for them. Because if we are not concerned about ourselves, for sure we must be concerned about the Muslim youth that are emerging amongst us and who we're raising, our very children, as I speak, mashallah, tabarakallah. And just to answer Mattio's question, Matteo, I'm referring to my publication, Extremists in Our Midst, Confronting Terror. Okay, that's you can purchase it on Amazon, mashallah. This was taken from excerpt mainly from my PhD studies of 12, 13 years ago. And Dr. Khalid, you can see when he's referring to his book, that's also taken from his PhD, mashallah, tabarakallah, which is also available on Amazon. So Khalid, I think that, as I said from the outset, this is such a huge subject, and it was important to at least attempt to touch upon some elements. And I brought those two main constructs, the legitimized identity, the resistance identity, so that we can see that there has to be some sort of harmony between the two by virtue of our Muslim identity. And I will conclude with these points, Khalid. I've said it before and I'll repeat it again. When we look at being Muslim in today's society, you're welcome, Matteo. And when we look at our identity today, we have the hadith of holding on to hot coals. Practicing our deen will be like holding on to hot coals. And everyone can imagine what that is. The hot coal will, the sheer pain that will seep into the body. Okay, not just the surface pain, the deep pain that will cause holding on to a hot coal. Practicing our deen has been likened to that. And I think it's very, very important that we understand the seriousness of Muslim identity, what it means, and the importance of understanding how to navigate this in the West, because the West is not going to open its arms and say, we want an Islamic state. We want to take things forward. You're right, Kira. Too much to talk about on this subject. I totally agree with you. And I saw that from my work and my research. They're not going to do that. They're not going to open their arms. They may open to an extent. They may allow some tokens to come through and tout them as the perfect example of a Muslim, and we all need to follow and subscribe to them. But we need to come to equilibrium within the societies that we're living in, and become comfortable within our Muslim identity and all these other aspects and facets of our identities that make us who we are today. It's so important that we recognize that, because many are getting lost. Many are getting lost. We do need true brotherhood to stop us losing our identity. We do need to have empathy for each other. We spoke a few weeks ago about understanding the different roles that each other plays, where we can have ta'awun. Okay, there are areas where we cannot have cooperation when we're talking from an usul ideological perspective, because some of the beliefs that some of us hold are not according to the sunnah. Okay, they're not up for the sunnah. We've had our non-Muslim colleagues who've engaged with us today, and I hope that you can see what we're talking about regarding identity and how the Muslim identity encapsulates all other elements of identity. We are not being told to change who we are, but we are being told to submit to a higher reality, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are being told to move away those things that are destructive to our own identities and our own self, and by extension, destructive to society when everyone else is practicing a particular characteristic that we possess. This is what Islam is. Islam is total submission. And when we totally submit, as we saw with the examples of all of the prophets, as we've seen with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we've seen with the companions, it not only changes society, because everyone looks on a wider context. the changes it affects internally, spiritually, is revolutionary. And I use that word. That's what I was going to say, Khalid. With holding on to hot coals, we have to understand that being Muslims today is revolutionary. I'm not saying Islam is a revolutionary religion. Some may say that it is. Yes, we can say that to an extent. Being a Muslim today, in the social climes and climates that we are in, is revolutionary, because we are resisting what society is pushing upon the masses.
Yeah.
And I will stop there.
I think something we have to acknowledge, and I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I think the reality, like with movements, and of course we're not talking about Islam as a movement, but just the reality is being a Muslim minority. Yes, and this is our whole topic, navigating Muslim identity in the West. The reality is most of the Muslims, I do not believe, will hold on to that strong identity. And I'm saying most. This is my belief and what my experience. And the more pressure, which is it's there. So we can't think it's getting easier. And the reality is, when you live, and I've learned this a lot being in where I'm living and I'm isolated. There's no Muslims, no, totally isolated. The challenges to your identity, the challenges, those are very real. Yes, we should be strong. These are all nice speeches, and we gave the examples of Umar radiallahu ta'ala, and most people are not going to do that. It's like any idea situation. Majority are not going to live up to the thing. So this is why the scholars emphasize hijrah and leaving, because you're automatically by default in a position of compromise in a non-Muslim society. That's just the way it is. You are compromised. Yes, there are pockets and there's things where you can more, have your identity, and where there's a larger Muslim population and stuff. But those challenges and those beat downs are there. Where I live, it is hardcore Trump country. So you already know with the right wing, how they view Muslims, and me, even as an African-American man here, it's different. It's different. I'm close to Texas, but it's an isolated place. So you can really, you see that vibe. I want to mention just something really, quote from my research. This was the interview I did with Shakir, a good friend of mine from Canada who's lived in Yemen now more than 20 years. So he's been through all these wars. He's lived there. He's a muhajir. So I interviewed him by WhatsApp. Here's what he said about some of these issues about hijrah and stuff. He says, as we know, Islamic beliefs are unchanging, but our application of Islam can change. And there are numerous examples of this in the history of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have the Meccan period, the Medina period, times of war, times of peace. We have times of strength and unity. We have times of weakness and division. We have places where we are under Islamic rule and government, and places where Muslims are not in that situation. So these are all different contexts which demand different approaches, practices, all based upon the book and the sunnah. Then also, he went on, because I asked him another question. He said, a Muslim, wherever he may be, is obliged or obligated to follow the commands of Allah according to his ability, whether he's in a Muslim land or the non-Muslim land. The fact remains, being in the Muslim land in that context, if we are applying Islam according to our ability, we're still making compromises. I do not know collectively if the Salafis in the West are practicing what Allah the Almighty has commanded, not making compromises in their religion. In general and collectively, I do not know if the Salafis are upon this. Is it to be taken into consideration and recognize that Muslims operate within the legal framework of a non-Muslim society? I understand that we follow and obey Allah the Almighty, irrespective of whether that is within the framework of a legal framework of that society or not, without making concessions. So the point is the reality is even we don't want to realize that, and we don't want to acknowledge that, and we say, yeah, we're holding on hot coals. We're doing the best you can. And that's all you can ask is taqallah mistata'tum. Fear Allah as much as you can, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. And all throughout the Quran and the Sunnah, this illustrates this. But the reality is, a lot of times we don't realize how much we're compromising. A lot of times we are in so many ways. You need that job. You need that job. So you end up compromising in order to get that job. You're not finding the situation you need to. So you're compromised in maybe your risk itself. Maybe there's a high mix of haram involved in your livelihood. All of these are challenges that can be very, very difficult to navigate in as a Muslim minority. So I think, yes, you do the best you can to hold on, but I think the reality is the masses will not necessarily, and this is the trend we kind of see, the masses are not necessarily, yeah, there are pockets and there's good, but I think a large amount of the Muslims are compromising to such an extent, and they're looking at just assimilation, and especially our brothers and sisters that are kind of new migrants to the community. You know, they just want, because they came for worldly wealth and maybe some, the glitter of the West or whatever, and maybe peace and stability. So they are not into rocking the boat. Their whole thing is establish my community, become wealthier, establish a store, this and this. I'll build a home back home, what have you. They're not really looking. Islam is the last thing a lot of people are looking, and they're willing to do everything. Go to the church and become a Christian. There's a lot of travesty there. So these tensions are going to remain. Yes, we strive our best to hold on to our Muslim identity. How successful we are, Allah knows best. And obviously it varies from community to community, and there are semi-success stories, and it's a complex topic, no doubt.
And alhamdulillah, I think there's so much, again, I mentioned that there's so much more we could be discussing. And I think that regarding Hijra, I think, Khalid, we will maybe leave that for another topic, because while I agree and I acknowledge what you're saying, there's an altogether different reality. Okay, you and I have lived in the Middle East. I'm still living there now, mashallah, tabarakallah. There's an altogether different reality on that. So perhaps our next discussion will be around Hijra, the ideal circumstances and the reality. Look at and this could follow on, I think, nicely from the discussion that we're having on identity. Octavia's mentioned the point: asylum seekers leaving their country and converting to Christianity on a large scale. That recent terrorist attack, so-called terrorist attack in or was designated a terrorist attack, should I say, be more diplomatically, in Liverpool or Manchester, I can't remember, Liverpool, I think it was from an individual who was a refugee who converted to Christianity, was seen in pictures in church. The local priest took him in and everything like that. So yes, there is that taking place at the moment. Now, in conclusion, for those who want to continue or want to contact Stream Islam regarding this show, the email address is there. And one of the things, Khalid, because we come on fortnightly, I'm going to put this to you on air. You know, I'm doing the Fajr Club with some of your other colleagues in America and everything. One of the things I found very, very interesting, I know we're very busy, so I wouldn't suggest one avenue, but I would suggest another. If our host in the background and the organizers, Hassan, are interested in doing this, a WhatsApp group could possibly be established to continue discussions around some of the things that we're discussing. Okay. And I've been involved in a very interactive WhatsApp group that follows on from the shows that we're doing. And it's really developing some healthy discussion and everything like that. And it's very decent and orderly discussions that take place. So perhaps that's something we can talk about off show and see if this is something. I'm sure that some of our participants and viewers would be interested in continuing such conversations beyond the show that's here. And so that's something Hassan saying it's something we should discuss, inshallah. Those of you who may be interested in such a additional forum or medium, please do let Stream Islam know. Post up your thoughts on this even after we finish the show, because Brother Hassan will be looking at those comments. But Brother Khalid, unless there's anything else you want to add to this, we can conclude. We always go up to 1.5 hours. I think that we need to, because it's only every fortnight, and we always end them on 1.5 hours. But yes, Matteo, thank you, Matteo, for saying that you'd be interested in that. Hassan, I hope you're taking note. But I'll hand it to you, Khalid, and we can conclude, inshallah.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add, but I do think, as an extension of this topic, maybe discussing some of the nuances of hijrah for the next show, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. I think that's very important. That's very important.
I agree.
And a logical extension of this topic.
Yes. No, I agree with you. So we can plan that for a fortnight. Thank you, everyone. Jazakumullah khair. And to Muslim guests, non-Muslim guests, thank you. I hope you found it stimulating and engaging. And we look forward to speaking to you, engaging with you in a fortnight from now. So good evening to non-Muslim guests, and salaam alaikum wa rahmatullah to our Muslim participants and viewers.
Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.